and welcome to WM classes. In the previous video, we studied the very basic of indifference curve, that in layman terms, or when you are very fresher to economics, if you're even starting from the scratch. So what would you understand by indifference curve? Now let us come to a very important part from where the actual questions are also asked, that that would tell you that your concepts are clear or not. So that is properties of indifference curve. Let's start. Properties of indifference curve. As simple as it seems, it have some deep concepts which you need to grasp before answering the question from this section. So the first property of indifference curve is that indifference curve slope downward to the right. IC curve always slopes downward. It slopes downward but also towards the right, not just downward but towards the right. Now, I'm sure that if you have studied indifference curve, you must already know this property, but understanding this property is more important. Okay, why is it sloping downward? So the slope of indifference curve, when it is sloping downward, it implies that when the amount of one good in a combination is increased, that is, if there are two goods, let us assume good X and good Y. So on a particular point on an indifference curve, you are buying different combination of, or a particular combination of good X and good Y. Say you are buying quantity 4 of good X and quantity 5 of good Y. Okay. So it implies that when it is sloping downward, that if you want to increase the combination, if you want to increase the quantity of one good in the combination, you will have to decrease the amount of that quantity of the other combination. In simple terms, when the amount of one good in a combination is increased, the amount of other good has to be decreased. Now, why is it important? It is important to obtain the same level of satisfaction. Why is it important? To obtain the same level of satisfaction. I think I might not have been very clear in explaining to you what it means, so I will try to explain it with an example. See, let's assume that you're buying two goods, again taking the same example, good X and good Y. Now you have bought, let's assume 6 units, okay, 6 units of good X and 8 units of good Y. This is one combination. This is simply one combination on an indifference curve. Okay, let's say it's this point where you are buying 6 units of good X and 8 units of good Y. Okay, 6 and 8, because generally we measure good Y here and good Y here and good X here. So you're buying 6 units of good X and 8 units of good Y. Now if at any point you want to change the amount of any good, say good X or good Y. Okay, you want to increase. Say now you want to buy 8 units. 8 units of X. Then you cannot buy 8 units of good Y at the same time. You will have to shift on buying 6 units of good Y. Okay, this is what this property means, that indifference curve slopes downward to the right, which implies that if at any point you want to increase the quantity of one good in a combination, then you would have to reduce the quantity of other good in that particular combination to be on the same level of satisfaction. Okay. Now what if the indifference curve is horizontal to the x-axis? Okay, what does that mean? Let's say if an indifference curve is horizontal to the x-axis, this means that the amount of x is increasing on every point, but the amount of y is constant. Now this will not yield the same amount of satisfaction to the consumer, right? But if you have been asked that what happens if an indifference curve is horizontal to the x-axis, then you'll have to remember this thing, that if the IC curve is horizontal to the x-axis, then in that condition the amount of good x is being increased at every point, whereas the amount of good y remains same. Now let's say there's another condition where IC curve is vertical to the y-axis. Now what is happening in this case? In this case, the amount of y is increasing on every point on the IC curve, whereas the amount of x is constant. Now even in this situation, the consumer will not yield same amount of satisfaction, right? So if it happens that the IC curve is vertical to the y-axis, in that case you must remember that if the IC curve is vertical to the y-axis, then only the amount of good y is being increased, whereas the amount of good x is kept constant. Okay. Now what happens if your IC curve is sloping upward? Now, we just studied that indifference curve slopes downward to the right, right? But if there is a condition that somebody has asked you that what does an upward sloping IC curve imply? So an upward sloping IC curve would imply that both good x and good y are being increased at the same time, which is generally not possible with the same budget. Obviously, if your budget is increasing, or like if your income increases, or if there is a price difference, so there might be a condition that you might be increasing the quantity of both the goods, but not in this manner. Okay. So an upward sloping indifference curve would imply that the quantity of both the goods are being increased in a combination. Alright, is this clear? So the first property is that indifference curve slope downward to the right. Coming to the second point, let's change the color. Indifference curve are convex to the origin. The second property is that the indifference curve are convex to the origin. They are not concave, they are convex to the origin. Now what does this imply? This implies that there is always a diminishing marginal rate of substitution as more and more of x is substituted for y. What does it mean? That there is a diminishing marginal rate of substitution as more and more of X is substituted for Y. This is because obviously when you will have lesser amount of quantity for a good, you would not want to lose more amount of that good compared to the other good which you already have in higher quantities. So when you are reducing the quantity of one good, now in the next step when you will again reduce the quantity of that good, you will not want to reduce it in the same amount, because obviously when you are buying it, you need it. So you cannot entirely what we say is that eliminate that good, right? You need that good, that's why you are buying it. But as long as you are reducing the quantity of that good, you would also want that good more and more. That good would be more dear to you. So indifference curves are convex to the origin, which imply that there is a diminishing marginal rate of substitution as more and more of X is substituted for Y. We can also understand this by an example. Say you have gone to a sweet shop. Okay, so you are buying 2 sweets from the sweet shop, say gulab jamun and jalebis. Now when you were eating gulab jamun, you bought 3 plates of gulab jamun. You had this budget of buying 3 plates of gulab jamun and 4 plates of jalebis. This was your combination. You had this budget that with this income I will be buying 3 plates of gulab jamun and 4 plates of jalebi. Now for any reason, be it the price or your mind or whatever be the circumstances, somebody is with you, someone is influencing your choice or anything, now you want to consume 5 plates of jalebis. Okay, instead of 4, you want 5 plates of jalebis. You would buy that, but the budget is fixed. What you will do is, you will reduce 1 plate of gulab jamun to 2 plates. Now you can have 2 plates of gulab jamun and 5 plates of jalebi. Now say again you want to increase your consumption of jalebi from 5 to 6. But now you will say that I'll only be getting 1 plate of gulab jamun. So that would not be fair, right? 6 plates of jalebi would be too much for you. Like, it would be too much sugar and too much of the same taste. So it would give you lesser amount of satisfaction, right? So you would not be willing to reduce 1 more plate of gulab jamun. You would be willing by a lesser amount. Say now you will be buying 1.5 plates of gulab jamun and 5.5 plates of jalebis. But in the next step, it might happen if you are a rational consumer, okay? We're talking about the rationality here. Being a rational consumer, you would not want to further increase the quantity of jalebi, because you know if you will increase the quantity of jalebi furthermore, you have to decrease the quantity of gulab jamun to a very lesser amount. So this is what is meant by diminishing marginal rate of substitution. Diminishing marginal rate of substitution. This was the second property. Now let's go to the third property. The second property says that indifference curves are convex to the origin and not concave to the origin. This is origin, so they are convex toward the origin and not concave towards the origin. Why is that? This is because of the diminishing marginal rate of substitution, that when you are substituting one good for another, higher the amount of good you will be substituting of one good, the lesser you would want the need to substitute the other good for that particular good. So the third property of indifference curve is, which is very basic and important at the same time, two indifference curve would never intersect each other, Recalling the basic definition of the indifference curve, we know that indifference curve is a curve which gives us different combination that yield equal amount of satisfaction to the consumer, which would give equal amount of satisfaction to the consumer. Now, why two indifference curve cannot intersect each other? Because say this indifference curve and a higher indifference curve which has more level of combinations, greater level of combinations, is also touching the lower indifference curve. IC and IC1 are intersecting at point A with each other. Now this would mean that this point on IC1 and this point on IC are giving same amount of satisfaction. But is that possible? When you have a higher indifference curve, IC1, where you have more quantity of both the goods. On a higher indifference curve, you will have more quantity of both the goods. On the other hand, on a lower indifference curve, you will always have lesser quantity of both the goods. Now, if they are intersecting at one point, that would mean that the IC curve 1 and IC curve, the lower indifference curve and the higher indifference curve, they are giving same amount of satisfaction. But that is not practically possible. So, two indifference curve would never intersect each other. They would never intersect each other. This would be even more clear to you with the next property, because the next property says that higher indifference curve yield higher level of satisfaction, We already studied about this, because a higher indifference curve will obviously have more quantities of both the goods. Who would not want more of both the goods, right? Anybody would want more of both the goods. We know that there is a diminishing marginal rate of substitution, and because of that, there might be a point that after which you would not want to substitute one good for another. अगर आपको एक गुड ज़्यादा चाहिए तो आप दूसरे गुड की क्वांटिटी और ज़्यादा उससे ज़्यादा कम करने के लिए तैयार नहीं होंगे. बट अगर दोनों ही गुड्स आपको ज़्यादा मिल रहे हैं तो कौन ऐसा बेवकूफ़ होगा जिसको दोनों गुड्स ज़्यादा नहीं चाहिए होंगे, है ना? Therefore, a higher indifference curve will always give higher amount of satisfaction. Why? Because the higher indifference curve, in this case, this one is the higher indifference curve and this one is the lower indifference curve. This higher indifference curve is giving more of both the goods. See, at this point, at the same point on IC, you are getting this amount of good Y and this amount of good X. On the other hand, on this same point, on a higher indifference curve, you are getting this much amount of good X, 0 to X, 1, 0 to X, and this much amount of good Y, which is obviously more of good Y and more of good X. Therefore, higher indifference curve will consist of higher quantities and they will yield higher level of satisfaction to the consumer. So this was about the properties of indifference curve. There are 4 most important properties of indifference curve. Indifference curve slopes downward to the right. Indifference curves are convex to the origin. Two indifference curve cannot intersect each other at any point. Okay. A cannot intersect B. Indifference curve A cannot intersect indifference curve B. Why? Because then it would imply that indifference curve A is equal to indifference curve C. But we know that higher indifference curve gives more satisfaction to the consumer. And the last one is higher indifference curve yield higher level of satisfaction because they have more quantities of both the goods. Now let's understand indifference curve in some cases, okay? What would be an indifference curve of perfect substitute? IC curve of a perfect substitute. This is contradictory to what? To that property of indifference curve are convex to the origin, okay? Now, why were indifference curve convex to the origin? Indifference curves are convex to the origin. The degree of convexity of the indifference curve, it depends on the rate of fall of the marginal rate of substitution of one good for another good, okay? So, the degree of convexity of an, by the time I will finish this, I'm sure you will understand it. There might be a chance that you might not be understanding what I'm saying at this point of time. But after a minute, just after a minute, you will be very clear what I'm trying to say. The degree of convexity of an IC indifference curve depends on the rate of fall in the marginal rate of substitution of x for y. Now, what is this rate of fall in marginal rate of substitution? This rate of fall in marginal rate of substitution means that when you are substituting, when you are exchanging one more quantity of one particular good for another good, how much more would you want to substitute? ठीक है, कोई गुड आपको कितना ज़्यादा प्यारा है, अगर आपको किसी गुड की बहुत ज़्यादा ज़रूरत है तो वहाँ पे जो मार्जिनल रेट ऑफ सब्स्टिट्यूशन क्या होगा, वो आपका उतना ही स्ट्रांग होगा, क्योंकि जितनी आपको ज़्यादा ज़रूरत है उतना आप सब्स्टिट्यूट करने के लिए तैयार होंगे. और वहीं पे अगर दोनों गुड्स की आपको लगभग बराबर बराबर ज़रूरत है, ठीक है, दैट इज़ इन द केस ऑफ परफेक्ट सब्स्टिट्यूट्स, कि दोनों गुड्स जो है वो बराबर इक्वली जो है आपको फ़ायदा पहुंचा रहे हैं, दे आर बोथ इक्वली इम्पोर्टेंट टू यू, then in that case the marginal rate of substitution would be very low or zero for you, क्योंकि दोनों गुड्स आपको सेम लेवल ऑफ सेटिस्फैक्शन दे रहे हैं, राइट? गुड एक्स से भी उतना ही फायदा है, गुड वाई से भी आपको उतना ही फायदा है, तो आप क्यों गुड एक्स को गुड वाई के लिए एक्सचेंज करोगे? इन दैट केस व्हाट वुड बी द शेप ऑफ एन इंडिफरेंस कर्व? व्हेन टू गुड्स आर परफेक्ट सब्स्टिट्यूट्स ऑफ ईच अदर, IC curve is always a straight line. Remember, when two goods are perfect substitute, अगर आपके दो goods they are perfect substitutes, in that case IC curve is a straight line. What is it? It is a straight line, and on this straight line the marginal rate of substitution for one good to another good remains constant. ठीक है, क्योंकि आपको दोनों गुड्स जो हैं वो बराबर ज़रूरत है, दे आर परफेक्ट सब्स्टिट्यूट्स ऑफ ईच अदर. सब्स्टिट्यूट्स का मतलब तो आई एम श्योर आपको पता ही होगा ऑलरेडी, कि आप एक गुड को दूसरी गुड की जगह बराबर यूज़ कर सकते हो, आपको कोई दिक्कत नहीं आएगी. ठीक है, तो जब व्हेन टू गुड्स आर परफेक्ट सब्स्टिट्यूट ऑफ ईच अदर, इंडिफरेंस कर्व वुड बी straight line sloping downwards where marginal rate of substitution is constant. यहाँ पे जो आपका marginal rate of substitution होगा वो diminishing नहीं होगा. ओके, we read ना कि marginal rate of substitution जो है वो diminishing होता है, जिसकी वजह से indifference curve जो होते हैं they are convex to the origin. But if two goods are perfect substitutes, in that case the indifference curve would be a straight line where marginal rate of substitution would be constant. So that's it for this video. In this video we studied the properties of indifference curve. Why are these properties in this way? What do they imply? And in last we also studied that what would be an indifference curve of a perfect substitute. Thank you so much.